Have you ever noticed that the people who know the least about a subject often seem to be the most confident about it? And have you ever had that deeply uncomfortable moment when you realized you might have been one of those people? Because I have. More times than I'd like to admit. A few years ago, I became convinced that I had completely figured out how investing worked. I had read a couple of books, watched some videos, followed a few finance accounts online, and honestly, I felt unstoppable. I remember sitting in a coffee shop explaining market trends to a friend who had actually worked in finance for years. At the time, I thought I sounded intelligent. Looking back, I sounded like someone who had learned just enough to become dangerous, because I wasn't knowledgeable. I was confident. And it turns out those two things are not the same. After reading the original Dunning-Kruger studies, later replication research, and dozens of psychological experiments, I discovered something that genuinely disturbed me. Some of the smartest people often doubt themselves, while some of the least informed people feel absolutely certain. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why confidence is often a terrible indicator of competence, why intelligent people frequently underestimate themselves, and why all of us, including you and me, are vulnerable to one of the strangest psychological traps ever discovered. The story begins in the late 1990s with a man named MacArthur Wheeler. Now, this sounds like the setup to a joke, but I promise you it's real. In 1995, Wheeler robbed two banks in Pittsburgh in broad daylight. No mask, no disguise, nothing. He simply walked into the banks, committed the robberies, and walked out. Police arrested him later that same day after surveillance footage aired on television. And according to the officers involved, Wheeler was genuinely shocked. His response? But I wore the juice. The juice. You see, Wheeler believed that rubbing lemon juice on his face would make him invisible to security cameras. Why? Because lemon juice can be used as invisible ink, and somehow, somewhere along the way, he concluded that this principle also applied to bank robberies. Now, it's easy to laugh at that story. Honestly, I laughed too. But here's where things get uncomfortable. Psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger didn't find Wheeler interesting because he was unusually stupid. They found him interesting because he was acting in a way that many of us do every single day. And here's the part that bothered me the most. The biggest victim of the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't the least intelligent person in the room. It's often the person who doesn't realize they're experiencing it, including the person watching this video right now. We'll come back to that. Dunning and Kruger conducted a series of experiments involving university students, testing them in areas like logic, grammar, and humor. What they discovered was astonishing. The participants who performed the worst consistently rated themselves far above their actual abilities. Meanwhile, many of the top performers underestimated how well they had done. In other words, the less competent someone was, the less capable they were of recognizing their own incompetence. And suddenly, the guy with the lemon juice didn't seem so ridiculous anymore. If you're finding this interesting so far, maybe consider subscribing. We spend a lot of time exploring the strange ways the human mind tricks itself. Now, here's the part that completely changed how I think about intelligence. Most people hear about the Dunning-Kruger effect and immediately think about other people. You know exactly who I'm talking about. The person who watched 3 documentaries and now considers themselves an expert on ancient history. The friend who spent one weekend researching nutrition and now thinks every doctor in the world is wrong. The coworker who refuses advice because they're convinced they already know everything. But here's the twist. The Dunning-Kruger effect isn't about stupid people. It's about people. All people, including you, including me. In fact, the very skills required to become good at something are often the exact same skills required to recognize that you're bad at it. Think about learning a language. When you learn your first 50 words, you feel amazing. You think, I've got this. Then you learn 500 words. Suddenly, you realize you understand almost nothing. Then you learn 5,000 words, and somehow you feel even less confident than before. Not because you're getting worse, because you're finally understanding how much there is to know. I experienced this myself while trying to learn video editing. After watching a few tutorials, I genuinely believed I had mastered the basics. Then I started watching professional editors work. Within about 20 minutes, I realized I knew absolutely nothing. Transitions, color grading, sound design, pacing, storytelling. I wasn't standing on top of a mountain. I had barely reached the parking lot. Honestly, it was humbling, and also kind of depressing. But here's the fascinating part. That feeling of uncertainty, it's often a sign of growth. Because real expertise doesn't always create confidence. Sometimes it creates humility, and nowhere is this more obvious than on the internet. A study published in Nature Human Behavior found that people who knew the least about subjects such as science and politics often expressed the highest levels of confidence in their beliefs. Now, to be fair, confidence itself isn't the problem. Confidence can be useful, necessary even. The problem appears when confidence becomes disconnected from competence, and social media may unintentionally amplify this effect. Think about it. Algorithms don't reward accuracy. They reward certainty. A person saying, well, the evidence is complicated and there are several competing interpretations, rarely goes viral. A person saying, I know the truth and everyone else is lying, often does. And honestly, once I noticed this pattern, I couldn't stop seeing it. Then I started asking myself a much more uncomfortable question. How many things am I confidently wrong about right now? And the answer, unfortunately, is probably a lot. There's another psychological experiment that illustrates this perfectly. Researchers asked people how well they understood everyday objects. Things like toilets, zippers, bicycles. Most participants rated their understanding very highly. Then researchers asked them to explain exactly how those objects worked, step by step. Suddenly, confidence collapsed. People discovered that they didn't understand nearly as much as they thought. This phenomenon is called the illusion of explanatory depth. And honestly, it's terrifying. Because if you've ever confidently explained something and then realized halfway through that you actually have no idea what you're talking about, congratulations, you're human. I remember trying to explain cryptocurrency to someone several years ago. At the time, I was convinced I understood blockchain technology. About 3 minutes into my explanation, I realized I was mostly repeating phrases I had heard smarter people say. I wasn't explaining. I was performing understanding. And I suspect we've all done that. I'd genuinely love to know if you've ever had a moment like that. Let me know in the comments because I have a feeling we're all a lot more similar than we'd like to admit. But here's what surprised me even more. The Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't only affect beginners. It also affects experts. That sounds contradictory, but hear me out. Researchers have found that true experts often underestimate their own abilities. Why? Because once you become highly skilled, you start assuming that what feels obvious to you must feel obvious to everyone else. This phenomenon is sometimes called the curse of knowledge. If you're a professional musician, you might forget how difficult it was to learn your first chord. If you're a mathematician, you might forget that algebra once seemed impossible. And if you're an experienced driver, you probably don't remember how terrifying your first day behind the wheel felt. The strange result is that beginners often overestimate themselves. Experts often underestimate themselves, and everyone else is stuck somewhere in the middle wondering what's happening. Remember that question I mentioned earlier? Who is most vulnerable to the Dunning-Kruger effect? The answer is unsettling. It's not the least intelligent people, it's anyone who stops questioning themselves. Because the moment we become completely certain that we're right, we also become less capable of recognizing when we're wrong. And that might be the most dangerous cognitive bias of all. If this video has made you question something you thought you knew, maybe leave a like. Honestly, I didn't expect this topic to challenge my own assumptions as much as it did. After spending weeks researching this topic, I've started to suspect that intelligence isn't about having all the answers, it's about recognizing how many answers you still don't have. And honestly, that's both terrifying and strangely liberating. So here's the question I'll leave you with. What belief have you become less certain about as you've gotten older? In our next video, we're exploring another psychological mystery that completely changed the way I think about human behavior, why our brains create false memories that feel absolutely real. Because honestly, after researching all of this, I'm starting to think that the smartest people aren't the ones who are always right. They're the ones who remain willing to discover that they might be wrong.